Hey, what's going on YouTube? Aaron Yoon here. Today we're talking about why the stock market goes up long term. Hopefully by the end of this video you can have a better understanding of the stock market, and if you want, you can sound smart and impress some of your buddies over dinner or something like that whenever we're allowed to hang out again. So the first reason is something that you're probably familiar with: retirement accounts. These types of accounts, for most people, it's going to take a percentage of your paycheck every 2 weeks or every month or whatever, hand it over to a broker who's going to put it into some kind of fund in the stock market. Most people have, especially if you're working in corporate America, your exposure to the stock market is going to come via one of these channels, these retirement accounts. Most people don't go out there and search for stocks to buy on a regular basis, because it can seem kind of scary. And if you don't believe me, the size of the industry should be revealing enough. This is $24 trillion industry, but you have millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars being pumped into the market every month out of people's paychecks. It's almost kind of like the way a tax might work in how automatic it is. And if you followed me for any period of time, I've been openly very critical of 401ks and IRAs because of the fact that they're also designed to buy even during times where it makes absolutely no sense to buy. The S&P 500 dropped 35% from its high in February, and by the time it was like mid-March or something, it was 35% lower. During those few weeks, 401k accounts were still buying stocks. You tell me if that makes any sense. Yeah, like people say it as a kind of like a buzzword, or so that you say that something over dinner, like that the stock market is the best investment because it always goes up long term. But if this is your exposure to it, 401ks and IRAs, it's not really the smartest way to do it. Now, the second reason the stock market always goes up over time is also something that should be pretty common sense, but we don't usually attribute this to the stock market, and that is inflation. Depending on who you ask and what period of time that you look for inflation, and in terms of how you want to measure it, you're going to find that it's something around 2 to 3% per year on average. If you're saying, oh, the stock market over the past 100 some odd years goes up 10% a year on average, and inflation goes up 2 to 3% a year on average, it's not as much of an increase as you think. The number of dollars might be increasing at 10%, but the number of dollars means very little. If you had $1 million in 1930, that's worth a hell of a lot more than having $1 million in 2020. So the number of dollars is not really how we should be measuring wealth. Inflation goes up 2 to 3% per year. The stock market goes up 10% a year on average if you look at long periods of time. This year is not a good example of that. 2020 is not a good example of that. But you know what doesn't keep up with any of that stuff is wages. Your annual salary, the median or average annual salary per American worker doesn't keep up with any of this stuff. One of the things that makes this a particularly important topic today in 2020 is that we just recently had a stimulus bill. Now this kind of is a game changer. When the coronavirus pandemic hit, the global economy shut down. And imagine the global economy as like the body of a human. And you're the medical surgeon or a doctor in charge of reviving this person, but they're just bleeding out, right? And so you might do some emergency procedures that are not healthy for them, but that you might give them a shot of like a steroid or like morphine or something, or some kind of narcotic injection, which is not healthy, but it's absolutely necessary to revive them in the moment. That is what the stimulus bill of $6 trillion represents. Why do I bring this up? I am not blaming them for injecting $6 trillion into the market. I do believe that it was a move that saved the economy, right? It saved the stock market from plummeting any further. So I do think that it was a necessary move, but here's the side effect of it. You know, if you take, just like we have in the medical field, if you take prescription painkillers for a legitimate reason for too long, it's very easy to get addicted to it, and that's a big problem that we have in this country. Similar kind of situation with the stimulus bill is that, yes, it was for a good reason, but the resulting side effect that we don't see yet, but is very likely to happen, is inflation is going to be much higher than 2 or 3% in the near future, in the long-term near future, in the next couple of decades. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't have a degree in economics. I am not an expert. I am not Alan Greenspan. No reason you should actually listen to me. Adding 2 and 2 together and connecting the dots, adding this much money into the stock market definitely lowers every single one of our dollars value in our pocket, which means inflation is definitely going to go higher, in my opinion. The third reason that the stock market goes up over time is that CEO wages correlated to share price. This probably doesn't come as a shock to anybody, because I think that this is one of those things that Wall Street gets a lot of heat for, is that their CEO salaries are based on their share price. So they'll do whatever they can to manipulate the share price, which is true to an extent. Have you ever seen a news headline where a big corporation, nationwide, global corporation, they issue massive layoffs? Tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 employees globally, and the stock price actually goes up. Well, it's because they just cut off 100,000 workers worth of wages, lowered their expenses. If their income is still the same, then yeah, the stock price, for the moment, the stock price will see a share price will see a major benefit for that temporarily. This idea of firing people on a large scale in order to save their share price is something that was completely unheard of before the late 1970s, 1980s. Before that, mass layoffs were not a thing. This idea that the businesses and the CEO's responsibility is to the shareholders came about by someone by the name of Jack Welch, famous economist and business expert, who popularized this idea, and then businesses really started to take off with it around in the 1980s. Well, in the 1980s, it was like the economy was booming. You really couldn't go wrong. So it did work for that decade. But businesses into 2020 are certainly not playing in the same kind of environment as they are in the 1980s, but they are using this kind of strategy where they're just manipulating share price, using mass layoffs. I mean, joblessness right now is at an all-time high in the history of the planet. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has something to do with that, but it's also a precedent. It's a move that CEOs of Wall Street companies are very used to. This is another reason that the stock market prices go up over time more than they'll go down, because the CEOs will utilize moves like this, and they have an incentive to keep the share price up. So moving on, the fourth reason that the stock market always goes up long term is also something that, if you think about it, makes a lot of sense, is technology. I spell that right? Okay, technology, yes. Since the turn of the century, we've been in a technology-driven world. Computing power doubles every 2 years. If we're living in a technology-driven economy, which we are, I don't think anybody would dispute that at this point in 2020, the economy doubles every 6 years. Which means technology is gonna keep growing. It's gonna pull the economy with it, and the economy going up is going to pull the stock market up with it. right? So this is it. So the stock market is getting a ton of help from technology. One way you can measure this is the infamous, FANG stocks. Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google. They're still the leaders of the NASDAQ. That's why you see the NASDAQ moves up and down first, and the rest of the equity indexes follow. The last reason that the stock market goes up over time, and this is a very simple business concept, but it's so often overlooked. This is the thing that drives price the most. That's why they save the best for last. Supply versus demand. When there's more supply, in other words, more people willing to sell a stock and not much demand, that if there's an imbalance, the price is going to go down. If there's a lot of demand, like everybody wants a stock, like everybody wants, let's say, some company that's going IPO, right? That's like an Uber on day one of IPO, or like Robinhood or something like that. Stock price is going to go crazy high. And once it's up there and the demand is exhausted, then supply wins, and then the price comes crashing back down, right? And people want to retroactively explain what happened with supply and demand by looking for a piece of news content that supports their claim, supports what price did. So usually people are thinking that news drives the price because they watch the news and then they look at what the chart did and oh my God, the news was correct. The news must have driven the price, but it's actually the reverse. Essentially, unless it's like something that's crazy, surprising news, like the coronavirus pandemic, right? That caught us all by surprise. Unless it's something that is extremely surprising, price isn't going to move that much. So if you just connect the dots based on what I just said about supply and demand, it would suggest that, all right, Aaron, if supply and demand is the number one driving factor of stock market price, and stock market, it tends to go up over time, that would mean that what? There's more demand, usually? You'd be absolutely correct, because supply, there's a finite number of shares. It's in the hundreds of millions or billions or some astronomical number like that you and me, no matter how much we buy, we won't actually make a dent. This is where you see a lot of splitting in order to create more shares, or reverse splitting to reduce the number of shares. But that only happens because there's a finite number of shares out there. Whereas demand is infinite. How is it infinite? The economy, we're always adding more jobs and adding more people. We're creating more people. The population is growing, not shrinking. Even with the pandemic, yes, we have a high number of deaths total, but on a global scale, our overpopulation hasn't really been impacted quite that much. So we have a steady supply of people growing up, entering the workforce, getting jobs, creating wages, and then buying into what we talked about in step number one, which is your 401k and IRAs. It's a symbiotic relationship that creates and generates virtually infinite demand, which means there's always going to be money pumped in, but there's only so many shares to go around. There's plenty, but it'll drive the price per share up. The more demand gets created, the more money gets created, the more inflation gets created, the more jobs are created, the more retirement accounts are created, and the more people are putting money away into their 401k and their IRAs, and it's just a big giant cycle that drives more money into the stock market and drives the share prices up. The stimulus bill of $6 trillion that happened recently is an excellent example, another excellent example of how demand is virtually infinite. Because where did the $6 trillion come from? Well, really, the central banks the Fed just made it up. They just said, okay, print $6 trillion and put it into the market. So they have the ability to create money out of thin air. What's to stop them from doing it again? I mean, there's an infinite capacity for that. It's another aspect of how demand is infinite and is always growing, and supply is kept finite by the company and the market in general. They keep this finite, and it drives the price per share up over time. So that's it for today. We went over 5 reasons. I went pretty deep into each one of those 5 reasons as to why the stock market always goes up over long term. Number 1 is the retirement accounts of people's IRAs and 401ks constantly putting money into the market, even when it doesn't make sense to do so. The model's just designed that way. Number 2, inflation. The cost of everything just goes up over time. The recent stimulus bill of $6 trillion doesn't help slow that down. It helps speed it up. Number 3, CEO wages are correlated to share price. CEOs are incentivized to make the share price as high as they can be at all times, no matter what the cost, even if it means firing a bunch of people and doing massive layoffs. Doesn't matter. It's all about the price, because that's how they make their money. Number 4, we live in a technology-driven world. So as technology goes up, the economy goes up with it, and the stock market goes up with it. It's just the economic nature of the society that we're living in. And finally, number 5, the biggest of them all, is supply and demand. So demand is virtually infinite. The central banks, or the Federal Reserve, can create as much money as they want, pretty much. They recently created $6 trillion, threw it into the market. We're also generating more and more people, which means more and more workers entering the workforce and contributing to 401ks and IRAs. Demand seems to be infinitely growing, whereas the supply of shares to buy in the stock market, there's a lot of them, but it's finite. So infinite is always going to beat out finite over the long term. So that's why the demand pushes the stock prices up over time. Hope all of that made sense. If you have any questions, leave a comment below and I'll get to them either on another video or I will respond. I'm pretty good at responding to comments. Hope you enjoyed the video. While you're here, make sure you hit the subscribe button. Make sure you hit the notification bell for daily content just like this, and stay tuned for the next video from YouTube.